Hello, Gene Schwimmer here. Welcome to today's vlog. Now on to today's subject, the advent of this whole new idea of, there's been transgenderism around for a long time, but this increasing demands that we accommodate transgenderism. Number one, the demand by people of one sex who identify with a sex that is not their sex, not their biological sex, demanding to use the public restroom of the sex with which they identify instead of the sex that they actually are. That was number one. And number two, the demand or the practice of especially biological males competing in female sporting events and running away with a prize because the biological women, they can't compete. But there's a motive behind all of this, and that's what I really want to get to today, is why is all this happening? And it's not just on those two subjects. I'm going to give you the general foundation of all of these demands from the left to basically change the whole culture and to denigrate our culture, our traditions, in favor of celebrating others from countries that are far behind ours in culture and technology and science and mathematics and you name it. In fact, I'm going to get into that later, that those other cultures are copying us. They're watching what we do and they're learning from us at the same time that we're denigrating us and favoring these other cultures that these other cultures are increasingly turning away from to embrace ours. It's really crazy. So why is all this happening? I have to introduce a new word. It's a psychological term, oikophobia. Oikophobia, O-I-K-O-P-H-O-B-I-A, oikophobia. What is oikophobia? As I said, it's a psychological malady. Well, it's actually had an evolving and an expanding meaning, being applied to more and more situations, circumstances. But originally, what oikophobia is, it's an aversion to one's home surroundings. So originally it was, I guess there are people who are afraid of their refrigerators, or they have a phobia about their refrigerators and their stoves and their furniture and just their surroundings. That's what it originally meant. It was a phobia, a fear of your own physical surroundings, the objects around you. Then it got expanded by a writer who was talking about traveling and hypothesizing as the desire to travel, a dislike of one's home surroundings. But in this case, we're not talking about just your physical house and your appliances and things, but your whole country, just your area where you live. An obvious example would be our forebears who were in Europe and decided they didn't like Europe and they traveled to America. That would be an example of oikophobia. But now to these two earlier definitions, we add a third definition that's come along just in the last few years. It coincides with the rise of the radical wing of the Democratic Party and the takeover of our campuses by left-wing professors. And that's a dislike not just of one's surroundings or one's physical country, but a dislike of the entire culture. In this case, the dislike manifests itself not in a desire to get away from the cause of the phobia, your culture, but to change the culture to conform to you and your desires and your fear of other cultures. It's everywhere. It's in college campuses where you have the death of Western civilization. I don't mean not the whole civilization. I mean the study of Western civilization. When I started college, these many years ago, I had to take humanities courses and we studied classical music. I learned how to look at a painting. Very valuable experience. We studied all the great masters, Da Vinci, Van Gogh, and Mozart, and Beethoven, and we learned not just about them, but how to listen to them. We learned this complex Western music. And now there's an obsession with ending the study of Western civilization. We are not to study our own history, which to me, history, if you're an American, it's the history of how we got from where we were to where we are. In other words, we start with Mesopotamia, the Tigris-Euphrates River, the Middle East, then you come to my people, actually, the Jews, and then the advent of Christianity, and then it spread to Europe, and you have the Greeks and the Romans. Basically, that's Western civilization. It's pretty much a straight line from then to now, and it's a question of how did we get here. And of course, you study other cultures and other countries, but mainly you're studying, I hate to say it, but you're studying wrong turns of history. There's a reason why those civilizations don't exist or they don't have any influence. There's a reason why, for instance, the American Indian never developed the wheel. And we're supposed to say that the American Indian culture and civilization is equivalent to ours, and they come up with these ideas that I remember used to be in vogue, maybe not anymore, but that our whole system of government comes from the Iroquois Indians, which is absurd. It comes from the Greeks and the Romans, democracy and republicanism, small r, not the Republican Party, republicanism. Then you get to classical music and literature, and you're getting back then to, especially music, to the Greeks and the Romans, and then the classical composers, but we're not supposed to study that anymore. And the irony is, and this is what I was alluding to earlier, in China, they study classical music very hard. They don't study except when they want to have folk art or something. Maybe you'll have some Chinese performers studying three-string instruments. I honestly don't know what they're called, but these very simple instruments from their ancient cultures. But in China, the Chinese kids are learning classical music, studying piano, learning how to play Western music, because they look at how advanced our civilization is and they want to be advanced too. So they study us. Meanwhile, we're supposed to take African music on drums or whatever, African art, and I'm not saying it's bad, it's good art, but it doesn't have the complexity and the subtlety of Western art, and we can study it to learn about other cultures, but they at the same time are studying us to advance their civilizations, because they understand that Western civilization is the greatest creation of the ages. In fact, the best way to illustrate this concept of what I'm talking about is to compare the American Indian and the Japanese. Now, that might seem very incongruous, but bear with me, because it illustrates very clearly the difference between one culture, the American Indians, who got it wrong, and the Japanese, who got it right. So let's start with the American Indians. The American Indians are an ancient culture. They go back thousands of years, and in those thousands of years, they never developed the wheel. All the time that the Greeks and the Romans were developing the wheel and the screw and the lever, they never developed the wheel. And for their seafaring efforts, they had dugouts and canoes. They never built anything approaching a three-masted sailing ship that could cross an entire ocean. Lots of settlers came from Europe to America. No Indians sailed from America to Europe unless they sailed on a European ship, because the Indians never developed that culture. Now, where they went wrong was when the European settlers came and they became familiar with them and they saw the more advanced European technology, they never learned how to make it. They would trade for rifles, but they would never visit a rifle making shop to see how to make one themselves, or how to mine metal, which they also didn't do. They never learned from the Europeans. What they tried to do, and which they got wrong, was they tried to keep their culture their primitive culture when they were faced with a modern civilization. And when you do that, when you have a primitive civilization meets a modern civilization, then it's a primitive civilization that suffered. That's going to disappoint a lot of liberals, but that's what happens. If you're a primitive civilization and then you make contact with an advanced civilization, then you better learn their ways, because if you don't, then you're going to disappear. And that's what happened almost entirely to the American Indians. To take another example, they needed large areas of land to hunt buffalo. It never occurred to them to fence off a portion of land and raise the buffalo right there and then just slaughter the buffalo right there. That makes more sense. They never, this is going to anger our friends on the left again, on the far left, but the important concept, maybe the most important concept that the Indians did not adopt was the concept of private property. Had the Indians simply adopted that concept of private property, of corralling a bunch of buffalo and raising them and eating some of them and using the other buffaloes to raise more buffaloes, then they would not have been affected when the Americans building the railroads, when Buffalo Bill was out there killing as many buffaloes as he could find roaming the range and thereby cutting off the Indians' food supply. Their situation would have been much different if they could have manufactured their own rifles instead, and their other weapons, and developed new weapons instead of having to trade with Americans to get those weapons. Maybe that would have made a big difference too. I could go on with this. That's how the Indians got it wrong. I don't want to belabor the point. You get what I'm talking about. But now let's move over to the Japanese, who got it right. And how did they get it right? When the first Europeans appeared in their ships off of the shore of Japan, the Japanese realized right away, because they were basically a feudal society with pretty primitive weapons. They said, if we do not learn from them, if we do not adopt their culture, at least their, well, culture is maybe going too far. If we do not learn their technology, then we're going to be extinct, because we cannot match what they have. And that's what they did. The Japanese embarked on a very active program to learn Western technology. I remember reading in one history book that, for instance, when the steamships appeared, the first metal ships appeared, they put steamships on their postage stamps to inspire people to invent and learn how to make steamships. So that's one thing, the technology, but then we can move into also nutrition. They noticed right away how much bigger and stronger the Americans were, and they wondered why that was. Part of it might be genetics, but they had another idea when they saw the Americans eating beef, because Japan was a vegetarian society. They saw Americans eating beef and Americans being bigger. So one day the emperor appeared eating beef. The emperor started eating beef, and that told the rest of the society that they should eat beef, and they did. And now there are Japanese, not a lot of them, but there are Japanese who are taller than I am. I'm 5'8". So there are 6-foot Japanese, but they are certainly bigger than they were in the 19th century. The point is that Japan today has a very advanced technology because they deliberately learned from us. They understood that we had a better technology, and the Chinese are doing that today. That's why we have this whole problem with them, of them stealing our technology, because they understand that our technology is superior, and the day is probably going to come when they start developing technology that is equal and maybe in some ways better than ours. That's what Japan has done on some occasions. So that's something that we have to watch out for. But now we shift over to Africa, and that's the question for them. Are they going to get it right, or are they going to get it wrong? Are they going to be like the American Indian and try to stay as they were in the face of advanced civilization, or, and by advanced civilization I mean Western civilization, or are they going to be like the Japanese and learn from us? It's clear to me that they made the right choice. They're choosing to learn from us. If you do a little Googling, you'll find story after story. Africa used to be hostile, for instance, to Israel. Well, they weren't at first, and then they became hostile because they had close relations with the Arab countries. So they followed their lead, but they have become increasingly friendly with Israel. So now you read all these stories of Israeli scientists and technicians going over to Africa and helping them develop their technology and their civilization, helping them especially in agriculture, which is very important there. They have an arid climate in some areas. The Israelis are experts at that. So they're teaching them drip irrigation, for instance, and other technology. They're helping them move up the technological and the civilizational ladder. Meanwhile, we have Americans denigrating our own culture that is being so avidly embraced by Africa. It's amazing to me. I don't understand why this is. Well, actually I do understand. It's oikophobia, that word that I introduced to you. Oikophobia is a psychological condition. It's an abnormal psychological condition. That's the problem, is we have the inmates increasingly trying to run the asylum, and they do in the universities and in some very liberal cities, like the city I fled from, New York. I don't know. I don't have the solution. All I have is my ability to say thanks for stopping by again. I'm glad you came to visit. Hope you come back. If you like this video, then thumbs up to show YouTube and the world that you like the video. If you have any comments to what I just said, if you're a liberal and you think I'm completely crazy, then you can say so. It's in there's a special section for you right down there below the video. You won't hurt my feelings, so go ahead. If you want to share the video, I'm not going to stop you. In fact, you can share the whole darn channel. If you have a Twitter account, you can tweet my URL, both to the video and to my whole channel, out to your followers. Invite them to retweet. And finally, you can subscribe, and you'll know about my new videos the minute they're posted. That's it. Have a nice rest of the day. Bye.